From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Betsy Peterson, Director of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, and I want to welcome you all today to the latest in our Benjamin Botkin Lecture Series. And a little bit about the Botkin series. It is an opportunity for us to showcase the best and latest scholarship in folklore, ethnomusicology, oral history, cultural studies, and heritage. And it also is an important strategy for us in terms of acquisition. As you can see, all of these lectures that we do in the Botkin series are videotaped and recorded and will be uploaded onto our website so we can share these lectures with the world at large, and they will be preserved in our library for generations to come. So today, while we're trying to get everything together, I have the honor of introducing a dear friend and colleague, the distinguished folklorist Tom Rankin from the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University. And Tom, who has recently stepped down as the director of the center, is still teaching there at Duke and teaching in art and documentary studies, but is also now directing the new MFA in experimental and documentary arts at Duke University. He is a Renaissance man, a photographer, filmmaker, folklorist, and owner of goats, I should add. And yeah, oh, okay. And, but Tom has been documenting and interpreting American culture for more than 20 years. And in his previous lives, he has been the Associate Professor of Art and Southern Studies at University of Mississippi, Chair of the Art Department at Delta State University. And Tom was educated at Tufts and at UNC at Chapel Hill and Georgia State. He's a native of Kentucky and has curated numerous, okay, there's the donkey, I guess, has curated numerous exhibits and articles and reviews, and has several books under his belt as well, including Sacred Space, Photographs from the Mississippi Delta, and Deaf Maggie Lee Sayre, Photographs of a River Life, Faulkner's World, and Local Heroes Changing America, Indivisible. I should also add, and I'm pleased to add, that Tom is also a member of the board of the American Folklife Center. So I guess we may, in fact, be ready to start or getting there, but in the meantime, please give a warm welcome to Tom Rankin.
It's great to be here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about how wonderful feelings I have for the American Folklife Center, but there's really no more important place for carrying on notions of documentary and American folk culture than this place. So it's great to be here. It's wonderful to have served on the board of the Folklife Center. And there's a number of people in the room that I've learned a great deal from through the years. I want to talk about, in some ways, the most important photographer you've never heard of. Or another way to say it is one of the more interesting photographers you've never heard of, and that's Paul Kwilecki, a native of southwestern Georgia. A guy who, I want to say a few things at the start, who in some ways took to heart, whether he did it directly or not, this idea that William Faulkner said of mining his own postage stamp of native soil, that his work could be both actual and apocryphal. And I want to talk about him throughout the next, say, half hour or so, and show quite a few of his images. I want to begin by reading the way Paul Kwilecki talks about this one place, this place in Decatur County, Georgia, in the southwest corner, that he photographed for really 50 years. This body of work is from around 40 years. He wrote, Decatur County is in the southwest corner of Georgia. Its southern border joins Florida, and its western border is less than 30 miles from Alabama. Every day, 30,000 lives unfold. Men and women get up, go to work, return home, and go to bed. Between rising and going to bed, they grow into their particularity. Life at the courthouse goes on simultaneously with life in the factories. Prayer meetings overlap shopping. Sunday picnickers are clerks and teachers on Monday. Every citizen wears many hats, and all the while, houses stand looking out on their streets, and cemeteries silently wait. Now, in that brief intro or definition of the geography he's dealing with, we learn I think there's a great deal in there about what Paul Kwilecki sees. First of all, it continues to come up in his work, both directly and more metaphorically, that cemeteries silently wait. This is in many ways his work, even though he never photographed, and I mean obsessively never, outside the boundaries of his county. When he came to D.C., he didn't bring his camera. He had no interest. He decided in the late 50s that he would make his project his county, or the county he was born in. But at the same time, this is a project, or his work is as much about home and leaving home as anybody else's project. And I think it's interesting to just point out, and to some of you it's obvious, but the camera, from the moment it was invented, was something where you took places and you went places and you came back with things. And in a way, Kwilecki works very, I'm sorry, I just bumped your microphone, works very differently than that. And yet I want to try to argue that in staying home, he may have gone just as far as anybody else, at least for him. His family were Southern Jewish hardware store merchants. His grandfather was a peddler, sort of the classic Jewish peddler in the 1860s and 70s, and within a few years had Kwilecki & Sons Hardware in Bainbridge and a couple of other places. And by the 1950s, the Kwileckis, you could say, were as kind of wedded into the power structure of Bainbridge as any other family. His father was at one time mayor of Bainbridge, was the bank president, owned the hardware store, and so on. So Paul Kwilecki ends up going to this is a photograph of the only prostitute in Bainbridge, or that's what he said. Paul goes to Emory, studies literature, thinks he wants to be a writer, comes back to Bainbridge, and begins photographing. And he begins photographing in a way that a lot of people, I think, began. He talks about, making pictures when he was very young, 10, 12, and then not for a while, and then being involved in photography at Emory. But he begins photographing, and he essentially is a self-taught photographer. He teaches himself to photograph by writing letters, and I'll read from some of them. Writing letters to people all over the country, particularly David Vestal, who had a lengthy correspondence, maybe one of the great sort of correspondences between a photography guru and somebody trying to learn as anybody I've ever seen. This is Paul in 2007 in his little office studio in Bainbridge. Just above his typewriter, in earlier years, he had taped on the wall a number of things. And I want to talk about that briefly with this picture of him up there. But carefully typed were some yellowed and brittled papers, which included Conrad Aiken's poem, Music I Heard With You, which begins, Music I heard with you was more than music. And next to Aiken's poem was stapled to the wall a photocopy from the book Approaches to Auschwitz, where he had marked and underlined Pierre Savage's A Jewish Survivor's quote, "If we do not learn how it is possible to act, even under the most trying circumstances, we will increasingly doubt our ability to act well even under less trying ones. If hope is allowed to seem an unrealistic response to the world, if we do not work towards developing confidence in our spiritual resources, we will be responsible for producing in due time a world devoid of humanity, literally. Then you read a little farther down on his taped things, Stephen Vincent Benet, I look in the houses when twilight narrows, and in each a man comes back to a woman. Or William Carlos Williams, it's difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. Paul was enormously romantic in some ways and enormously fatalistic in others. His daughter Susan says that he told the kids, he had 4 children, his favorite story to tell them was of artists who were brilliant and who died unknown and were later discovered. They found dinner very depressing, but this was the way he talked. And he, as he began to photograph, he began to, in his darkroom in his house, he began to keep these copious journal books, charting what he thought, what he was doing, what lenses he was using, and so on. He begins, this is a photograph from the 60s. You can't have a southern county seat, particularly in the deeper South, without having the Confederate monument. They're there everywhere. He photographs this Veterans Day, and we'll return to that. He returns to that. One of his early, very, very compelling series, compelling for him, was his realization. You've got to understand, he lives in town. It's easy to imagine maybe that everybody in Decatur County knows each other. Well, the outer parts of Decatur County are foreign to Paul Kwilecki. He works in the hardware store. People come in from all over the county, but he doesn't necessarily go out. He begins to go out and discovers this agricultural tradition of shade tobacco, which was a tobacco grown. Alan, did you all document shade tobacco? Yeah. So tobacco grown under cheesecloth to use on the outer wrappings of cigars. And there were only a few places in the country that had a big shade tobacco industry, and Decatur County, South Georgia, was one of them. He writes in his notes, and these are the kind of field notes he would type at the end of the day and put in these books. And this is just one talking about his tobacco pictures. So he leaves this really remarkable record, not just of what was going on. He's not an anthropologist. He's not a folklorist. He's not pretending to be. As he often said, I photograph what interests me and I leave everything else alone. So this is not a sociological study of the county. I'm very sorry. Just hit the mic again. It is a photographic response to where he lives. It's a very personal body of work, and it's also a body of documentary work. Kwilecki would argue if he were here, those two pursuits are inseparable. I love this little triptych of guys shooting craps in the turn row of a shade tobacco field taken in the early 60s. How did he work? He went home at the end of a day, developed his film, and made prints then. This is putting up the cheesecloth in a shade tobacco field. He was somebody that certainly by today's measurement would have been a very sort of obsessive craftsman as to how he worked. He made prints every year, every week, but at the end of the year he would put them in a box and move on to another project. He had in his mind series of projects, shade tobacco being one of them, done over several years, and when he was finished and moved on to something else. He would move to photographing workers working in shade tobacco. He would move to photographing religious life. He particularly felt an affinity for people he at least perceived to be outsiders in the community, people that were not seen. Paul's daughter Susan, who teaches at Radford University, said to me that her dad felt himself on the fringe all the time, always left out, always sort of seeing things from a different angle. And he tended to find in his community those people more attractive to photograph than others. He also returned to this same gravestone over and over and over again. And when I was editing this book, which I started to do with Paul, and he died in 2009 before it was finished, I decided and did have the chance to explain to him that I wanted to use the Harris angel that he would go back to. It's one of the few things that he would return to, and I don't think he was quite aware that he did. But I'll read something he wrote about the cemetery and about this angel. Oak City Cemetery is the terminal address, there again is that reference, the terminal address of those who walked Bainbridge streets, lived in its houses, and imparted their vitality to its history. It retains an inventory, the remains of a former governor of Georgia, a genuine duchess, a movie star, and an advisor to the President of the United States. The rest would carelessly be tagged ordinary citizens. The population of Oak City Cemetery is not enumerated by census takers, but if it were, it would show that at times Oak City Cemetery grew faster than the city of Oaks. There's a marble angel in Oak City Cemetery on the grave of Sarah Will Harris, who died in 1926 at 7 years of age. A sunbeam from earth has vanished, it says below the figure. The marble is of good quality and supple. Limbs and face are very real. And we'll continue to see this angel as a kind of a timepiece to what Paul is doing and what's happening in the community as well. This photograph, this is the photograph that's probably of his that has been seen the widest. It's Miss Tomlinson at the House of Tomatoes is the title. It is the photograph, it's the photograph that gets closest to any kind of sort of postmodern irony that is so wedded to the history of photography at this point. This is right on the edge, and most of things that Kwileckis would have taken wouldn't even have this kind of almost possible ability to just laugh and not go much farther. He tended to photograph things he admired, things he felt an affinity toward, and not so much, you won't see pictures in this body of work of politicians he despised, and he despised most of the politicians of Decatur County. You won't see one picture. So there's a way in which I think there's some dark truths in this body of work, but in another sense, it is very much his arms around his own one home place. In these journals, and one of the wonderful things about working with his collection, his archive, which is now at Duke, is the tracks he left through his writing. And I'm just going to, this is another page. Just imagine somebody typing this at night, no typos, putting it in his little book, and then the next day. But I wish I could write well. I think this is in like 71. I think writing day books would be a challenge worth meeting. He's referring to Edward Weston's day books, which he'd been devouring. Day to day, most people experience a good many important feelings, and if one had the power to put them down in a literary way so that the gut feelings came through and the anxieties were recalled with some real candor and vividness, something really strong and worthwhile might be compiled over the years. In a way, this is what I am doing photographically. And he goes on to say later in that paragraph, about 4 years ago, I began to sense an interest in documentary work, but it was weak and non-specific and little more than an idea. Who is he writing to? You know, I mean, how many of us do that? Who's he writing to? He's writing to this audience that he believed would someday pay attention to this work. But he's also writing to himself to kind of exercise all his doubt, which he had an enormous amount of. Maybe not any more than the rest of us, but he documented it profusely. And he's writing because he believes that he's on a trajectory. This is 1971 when he writes that. He continues photograph until 2000, eventually wins a Guggenheim, and some things begin to happen. But in 1971, he was a frustrated hardware merchant working for his dad, photographing at lunch and after work, and listening to his dad say, "What are you doing that for?" And back to the angel, kind of home and away. back to that terminal address, trying to see the angel at different times. When is he interested in seeing the angel because the environment around it has changed, or because his point of view on the angel has changed? I think it's inseparable. The answer to that is hard to get to. The bus station in Bainbridge, another one of his projects. This is in the black section of the bus station. This wonderful picture from outside. These series, again, whereas some collections, some archive collections, are bodies of negatives, when he finished this project about this county, he had deposited 538 archival black and white prints in boxes, and that is the project. He understands that his negatives may be used for something else, but this is his project, this negative, this interpretation of this negative, back to that angel, that interpretation of that angel. He may have photographed the angel many other times. He didn't print them. So in his mind, that's not part of this particular iteration of his work. In addition to documenting how he felt about things, he left behind this insanely obsessive, only Carl Fleischauer would have more detail. But this is a print that's 4 by 6.5, Spiritone GL2, that's the kind of paper, F8, basic exposure, blah, 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 burn in right, I mean everything, how it's toned. I use that word obsession because I haven't found any other one, and I don't think it's a negative word at all. I think you can't make this kind of body of work without a particular, a kind of obsession. You also can't probably, this is him at the angel, you also probably can't make this kind of work without some of the characterizations of where Paul felt isolated as a photographer, where he felt like he was really outside of the marketplace, where he felt like nobody may ever look at this, so I'm just going to do what I'm going to do. He began to photograph the courthouse. I'll read what he says about the courthouse. And the courthouse is not a photogenic place. I don't know any courthouse, the life of the courthouse that's photogenic. But he says, I was drawn to the courthouse as a subject matter because it is inherently dramatic and because it is where politics gets down to the individual. No matter how much newsprint and airtime is spent on politicians, it isn't until the laws they enact make contact with you and me that we feel the yoke of government. The building's institutional coldness and its clumsy hulking that dwarfs the human figure strike at the vulnerability of people, producing an atmosphere of estrangement that can be read on the faces of all who go there. In its most authoritative mode, the courthouse is where one may enter a free man and exit a prisoner. The collective will of society, euphemistically called justice, can fall like a sledgehammer. You get a sense of, given how he saw this courthouse, and yet for all of his feelings about it, he would go there over and over again trying to make pictures that said some of that. One day he was there and happened to end up being the witness for a Justice of the Peace wedding. This is unusual that he would take a series like this, a sort of process series, but he took these 3 wedding pictures. The only wedding he photographed. No, that's not true. He's photographed another one. You'll see another one. Later, when the courthouse was renovated, deemed to be a historical structure, the renovators that did the work were all prisoners, and he photographed their work. He went every day to photograph the prisoners at work, doing all of the manual labor of masonry, of whatever, of stripping paint. This is a prisoner who just fixed or cleaned the chandelier, probably both. Again, you see Kwileckis's attraction to things to people that lie outside the frame, and sometimes to subject matter that lies outside the frame of other photographers. How many photographers can we name that photograph in supermarkets? He did one of the most interesting series about shopping, all done at the local grocery store. The same grocery store he shopped at, the same grocery store that his parents shopped at, the same community. He's standing on the edge as an outsider and an insider almost constantly. When 1966, I said he was self-taught, he'd write anybody, so he writes to Ansel Adams, needs some advice. And Adams, of course, writes back. He has this correspondence with pretty much everybody wrote back. He writes to Adams and says that he someday, this is 1966, wants to make a book of his photographs. Maybe one good book in a lifetime, no text, just pictures. Then he goes on to say to Adams, one of the biggest obstacles I've ever had to overcome is my reluctance to get up and walk on my own 2 feet. One begins by looking at good photographs and to some extent imitating them, but the day finally comes when he has to turn loose the hand that sustained him and take steps alone. For some reason, this seems a perilous act. It did for me, but I think I've pretty well done it now and am much on my own. I'm taking my 35 millimeter camera into places around here no camera has ever gone, into shanties, into tawdry small-town cafes, not the Robert Frank kind, the South Georgia Bible Belt kind, into the kitchens and hallways of farmhouses, and there in the middle of things people live with. And he goes on to ask some questions about how he ought to develop his film and make his prints. Back to the angel. This book is organized chronologically, and that's loosely meaning that sometimes his series, like Shade Tobacco, would stretch over a couple of years, and I didn't separate those. But it's organized to see both the evolution of an artist, a documentary artist, and also the evolution of a community. In 1968, he writes to the curator at the Riverside Museum in New York asking for an exhibit. And this gives you a pretty good window on the character of Paul Kwilecki. I am a photographer and amateur. Is there a chance of having my work shown at your museum? I dislike New York. It's too far away and too big, but I understand there are people there who like good photography. It didn't get the show, but it's a great letter. He did a big body of work that became somewhat of a catch-all called Workers, and this is a few from that, particularly workers meaning people at their job. This is Durwood Wilson selling engagement ring to a young guy with his dad looking over his shoulder. The most ordinary of moments. Kwilecki had access, whatever access he wanted in some ways. They were known throughout the community. He had seen lots of these people as they came in to buy 10-penny nails and roof and tin or whatever they got at the hardware store. And so, as he often said, he photographed what interested him, and that took him in a lot of different places. He really wanted to try to get down on photographic paper the way he felt about his place, and also a sense of the history and culture of the place. Probably the person that he borrowed some from Faulkner and from Joyce. He was very well read, the sort of ideas about place. But he also, when he died, I ended up looking, all his books came to Duke, and his copy of Eudora Welty's One Writer's Beginning was pretty interesting because he had written all through it. There was an incredible amount of marginalia. And this quote from Welty, when she's talking about her own work, this is, of course, simply saying that the outside world is the vital component of my inner life. My work, in the terms in which I see it, is as dearly matched to the world as its secret sharer. My imagination takes its strength and guides its direction from what I see and hear and learn and feel and remember of my living world. But I was to learn slowly that both these worlds, outer and inner, were different from what they seemed to me in the beginning. And he underlines even more deeply or more boldly, with the accretion of years, the hundreds of photographs, life as I found it, all unposed, constitute a record of that desolate period. That's Welty's words, but it could easily have been Kwileckis. By the mid-'70s, Kwileckis began to have some success. He sold a number of prints to the High Museum of Art. Alex Harris, who was teaching at Duke then, invited him to come lecture in 1975 to a class. It kind of, if you've ever wondered if it makes any difference when you ask somebody like that, it kind of transformed his whole sense of himself, that somebody teaching somewhere, particularly a university in the South that he thought was a good university, is a good university, but I mean, that he saw as a good university, would ask him, and it really transformed how he saw himself, and that began the process of his work coming to Duke. In 1980, there was a small book of his photographs called Understandings published. By the early 70s, though, he had, with the death of his father in 1971, he decides to sell the hardware business and become a photographer full-time. He writes David Vestal, "I thought you might be interested to know that I'm selling my business in order to devote more time to photographing." Vestal writes back and basically says, "You're insane. Nobody makes a living as a photographer." He did it, and he has essentially spent the rest of his years focused solely on photography, solely on trying to make this big project, is what he called it. It would be as if, you know, one of us had decided we were going to spend all of our years on one particular project. We'd made that a choice at the exclusion of anything else. This is a photograph of Horace Battles, another photograph that gives what he writes about it gives us a window in on how he sees both himself and the community. Horace Battles worked at the Alberta Crate and Box Company. They made crates for tomatoes and, you know, shipping crates for vegetables initially and many more things eventually. But Horace Battles was somebody he knew. The man who blew the whistle was Horace Battles. When I was photographing at Alberta, I ran into him. I asked him if I could take his picture in front of a big monogrammed boiler. He was annoyed but left the conveyor he was aligning and did as I asked. There's a lot in that sentence. I wanted to tell him how, as a boy, 41 years ago, I listened for the whistle so intently I could tell when someone else was blowing it. Horace hit it precisely on the second stroke of 6 o'clock. His deputy was not that exact. But the noise of the boiler shed made conversation impossible. He would not understand even if he heard me. The picture was made and the moment passed. There's a lot of that feeling in Paul and in his work that no matter what he tries to do, he can't quite get his arms around all of it, and nobody quite will understand. He didn't feel particularly understood. I don't know that his work wasn't in shape where everybody could sort of see it. They can now, but I think he still felt very much like the outsider in his own place. His work probably richer for that. He said in his Guggenheim application, "I believe in its ultimate value as a document, provided the promise that is now in evidence can be fulfilled. Hopefully it will be distinctive, not for the uniqueness of concept, nor for its tacit premise that Decatur County is the world in microcosm, but for its consistent personal and therefore human point of view." This is a hog killing at the prison. And another one of those photographs that certainly does kind of harness itself to the notions of irony and critique. This is the prison's Museum of Prison in Decatur County. This was their museum exhibition. And one of the few pictures that's in this book, or that he really took and printed, finished, that's of, you know, a kind of representation of a representation. You know, the photograph is representing an exhibition. Although the Baptist church parking lot. He was drawn very much to faith communities, white and black. More sympathy to the black church without question. He himself was he argued that he was an atheist. He was a regular member and contributor and supporter of the local synagogue. He claimed no real faith in much of it. I'm not sure that I believe that, but that's what he said. This is a new outdoor baptismal pool where he went to a night baptism. He became very close and very collaborative and reciprocal with a number of black ministers. And his daughter, who's a religious studies professor at Radford, did a kind of ethnographic work in where she interviewed a number of these ministers on issues of faith. The ways in which he could move in and out of different contexts is not surprising to anyone that's looked at documentary photography. But what's different is that I think that he's staying there and that he's returning often and that he's shooting the baptism one year and the next year and editing his own work and winnowing it down to his single best representation. This is the only other wedding that he ever printed. He liked to say that feeling is one of the highest forms of knowing, and was adamant that local Decatur County people, friends as well as strangers, didn't really understand his commitment to this project. They thought he was kind of crazy, he would suggest. His dark mythology of that lone sort of laboring artist, unrecognized in the vineyard day by day, year after year, I think in a way really sustained him and may have given him the kind of tenacity to just keep making beautiful prints and sticking them in a box and hoping that somebody would find them. Mine is an egocentric document, he said. Now, you don't hear that in folklore school. Mine is an egocentric document. Comprehensiveness or objectivity, making no claim to comprehensiveness or objectivity. I photograph subjects who are to me vivid and substantial. I leave everything else alone. Now, I don't know that it's that different from the way a number of us photograph. I think his thinking about it and articulating it is different. The way he sees his work. This is a series of houses, houses in town, in Bainbridge. As I started working with Paul on this, this one just sounds so much like that fragment of a poem I read, when I look in the houses when twilight narrows. Back to the angel coming apart. As Paul and I worked on this book, worked on the idea of this book, and began to look through his photographs, starting in about 2005, The Angel Repaired. Spent a lot of time on the Flint River. Bainbridge is formed by the Flint River. It wouldn't be there if it weren't for the Flint River. His own grandparents met on the Flint River, or courted on the Flint River. She was downstream, and his grandfather would take a boat down and see her. So he was really drawn to the Flint River and to the way that it, not just that history of it, he knew that history, but he was drawn to how it manifests itself now with people in the community. How do people interact with this space, and what's it look like? And what does that Willis Park, that place I showed you earlier of the Confederate monument, what does it look like, and how does it change? There it is. Well, I'm pointing on my computer, but there it is back in the trees as the guy talks on the phone. But how does it change? What kind of things happen around it? One of the things that happens in Willis Park is it becomes the place for the integrated school to have prom pictures made, almost seemingly unaware of the juxtaposition. Paul Kwilecki's not unaware of the juxtaposition, but this event that happens year after year and still happens on that same space, tracking the way these spaces change over time and the way that Kwilecki changes and how he looks at it. When late in working on this project, there's a great series of photographs of the prom. I know no other photographer that has paid attention to the prom in a small town. Probably no other photographer could have had these juxtapositions, I don't know, but it's remarkable. Back to the angel, who seems to always be in a different state of mind, different state of repair and disrepair. Emblematic of just what happens anywhere. And yet, you know, Paul is really sort of adamant that this is not just a way, you know, that the simple thing to say was, well, every place looked at carefully is universal. He's really interested in seeing it a little more placed than that. He said one time to a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, setting limits allows you to fully understand the subject. And then goes on to say, there's no such thing as a simple life. Everyone wakes up in the morning not knowing what's going to happen to him. Everyone has anxieties. It's the fate of human beings. That's what I'm interested in, how they cope with it. This is the last picture in the book. It's in 2000 of the Martin Luther King Day parade preparation. He quit photographing around 2000 in part because he began to suffer from a shaking. It wasn't Parkinson's. I don't know. I don't think he was ever clear what it was, but he had trouble holding the camera, and so decided to begin to just see it as bookended over 4 decades. And we would sit at every afternoon at 5 o'clock. His wife, Charlotte, and Paul would have something they called Drinkypoo. I didn't make that up. That's what they called it. And they would sit out on this porch. They had since moved to this kind of nondescript neighborhood, looks nothing like the world of his photographs, and he would have one scotch and she would have her glass of wine. And so when I was there, we would sit, and the other companion there would be his dog, Rebby, which people in town thought was Rebel after the South, but it was actually from Fiddler on the Roof. And he never told them. So everybody in town thought he had a dog named Rebel that he called Rebby. And we would sit there, and it was so clear that the world he's while he is a local, he is an insider, it is his county, what we're looking at is a county that he's not photographing. You know, that this is his home view. We haven't seen any photograph of this this is Turtle Pond Road, you know, the classic cul-de-sac from a 80s development, a much more comfortable place for them to be, much smaller. And you really get the sense of this sort of way in which Kwileckis could go a long way, traveled a long way in this one county from this one place, and was sustained by it, was encouraged by it, felt like it was doing something, and was genuinely fascinated by what he found there. I'll just read, I'm going to close with one. He wrote me a letter that I didn't really notice. I'll be quite honest, I didn't notice it when I wrote the essay. I don't know how I missed it. But in 2005, he wasn't even sick, but he writes this about this book that he didn't see to publication. I've been struck by how much more clearly we see the life of a person after death than before. When there is no more to come, there's a self-contained, finished quality to the life that while the person lived was open-ended. In the case of a new book, it will be clear that there were threads that ran from start to finish, and they can be looked at as they developed. Much of this went on unknown to me. I hope, there is continuity of feeling and viewpoint. Some of the pictures in my first book are among my strongest, but they can only be seen as individual photographs. In the new book, there's a timeline, and time is certainly one of the most important aspects of my work that was utterly beyond the scope of anything I understood earlier. Well, that kind of understanding of his own work, you know, is part of what this whole book was about, and what the struggle to work with him to let go of some of those earlier feelings and to see this as an evolution. In many ways, it was wonderful to work with him on. It was easier to complete after for just the reason he says, that we can often see things much more clearly and much more poignantly, and they become even in some ways more important. His work is so much about, home and away from home, about beginning and end, about life and death, and I think that's something he knew all along. Thank you. And thanks to Guha for getting us projection. I don't know if we have any time for questions. This is an area you know. You and Carl spent a lot of time. Did you all spend time in Decatur County?
We were just north of that,
Yeah.
I think.
In Miller County, you were in Miller County, I know.
Well, we were based at Tifton, in
Right.
Tift County, and went where's the other one I can remember? I'm having trouble remembering some of the others. But they were in the adjacent.
You were near Moultrie, I know.
Like an 8-county area,
Right.
South Central.
Yeah,
And this is more southwest.
right. It's farther. This is the last county.
But, good stuff. I thought back, you asked about tobacco. I think we did tobacco there, but it was Brightwood, wasn't it?
Not shade
Not
tobacco.
the
Yeah,
shade
well, it was
tobacco.
flue cured. I think flue cured and the tobacco was prime, the leaves
Right.
picked rather than air cured.
Right.
I remember.
Well, this was gone pretty soon after it is the one thing that he photographed that he really was aware that he was documenting something that wasn't going to be. A lot of other things turned out to be that way, but that wasn't his initial impetus.
And as Beverly knows, the FSA coverage of shade tobaccos in Connecticut.
Right. That's the other place that it was, and I guess that's where it continues to be grown.
So,
Oh.
what's the status of the book here?
The-
Did you bring a copy?
Yeah.
Or is it in the
Yeah.
printing
No,
press?
it's out. It'd be out. I think there's some back here. Alan?
Did he ever do color or talk about the preference or the black and white?
Yeah, he talked about it. He was, I was telling Nancy this earlier, he was not, he was a curmudgeon. And when he talked about his taste in photography, it was pretty much locked in a sort of, from the 30s to the mid-60s, it was black and white. It was somebody processing their own stuff. It was the print. It was not real high contrast. He tended to print fairly low contrast, even compared to, say, Gene Smith and those. He looked at all those people, but he was not, I don't even know in his photo book collection whether he had many color photographers. It just wasn't what he was interested in. And a part of it, I think, is that he's so interested in that complex line between actuality and metaphor, between the symbol of what's going on and what's actually going on. And I think that for him, black and white, allowed him to sort of live there. It's that actual and the apocryphal kind of. So no, he didn't. He also claims he never took any family pictures, although it turns out that he did kind of learn his early, he used his kids for his early experiments, and that made some nice portraits of them. But later he didn't do that. He'd go to New York, he wouldn't take a camera, he didn't. Nancy.
How is this, has there been any feedback from Decatur County?
Mhm.
How is the local community reacting to this?
So I always, the way I answer that, there's been a lot of very positive feedback. I'm sure there's been some negative feedback that I don't know of, but I know of a lot of positive feedback. There's going to be a show of his work. We're touring a show of vintage prints, and we're going to make an exception for the space. And I mean, they're going mostly to museums, but it's also going to go to Decatur County and to Bainbridge. And the books have sold. The pharmacist is selling books just constantly. I've gotten all kinds of letters. There's a community college honors program that's using it as a semester-long study of local vision of local community. So there's a lot of, but I don't really know the whole story, you know, and I'll know more when I'm going to be down there, and we're probably going to have some conversations about race and this work in the community, black and white conversations around, because it's a pretty interesting way to get to some of that doesn't get. Decatur County is a complicated well, all those South Georgia counties are, you know, there was nowhere more, I'll just point this out, you probably noticed it, but Albany, Georgia was one of the really important places in the civil rights movement and incredibly volatile in those communities. There's not one picture of a politician, of a demonstration, of a sign, of any of that. Now, that's not because Paul wasn't, but why is that? I don't really know, to be honest, except that he would talk about how, you get some of it from the way he talks about the courthouse. He's more interested in these ideas than trying to like find the courthouse dropping the hammer on somebody. He's more interested in saying that's what it does and suggesting it. But there's a lot not here, is my point. There's a lot that went on there that's not here, and I think in the conversations in Decatur County, there'll be some of that will be interesting to hear people talk about.
It seems to me your point about irony being absent, most of them in a way connects for me with the business of keeping overt political expression out of it. I mean, you did a Martin Luther King parade, which
Right.
is to some degree an expression. But I think it sounds to me like you were on track with doesn't do irony
Right.
statement, and by avoiding overt political expression, you know, he, in a sense, undercuts anybody's ability to make simplistic readings of
Right.
pictures. The other thing I would say, I'm sorry, I'm jumping in ahead of people that had their hands dutifully raised, but it's fun for me because it blurs the boundaries that we sometimes establish between, let's say, fiction and nonfiction in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
You know, did Zarkowski do the book on the one with mirrors and windows?
Mm-hmm.
The
Yeah.
metaphor of mirrors and windows. Well, which for those who haven't seen it, you know, a mirror photo is self-expression about what the artist has on his or her mind, and
Right.
a window is a documentary photographer looking out the window and taking a picture of that which is out there. But your reporting on his discussion of his own processes and thoughts, you know, indicates that somehow you've got window-like photographs that are in some sense a mirror.
Right.
You
No,
know,
I think,
this thing.
yeah.
And it's hard not to be reminded of somebody like Faulkner, where you wonder whether is it better than a documentary nonfiction book could ever be
Mhm.
about,
Right.
you know, Oxford, Mississippi, you know, that this somehow surpasses that.
Right.
What's
And I think
true
Paul,
reportage and what's fiction.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, maybe great art always blurs this distinction, and here's another example.
and I think he would probably argue, and I always wish he were here to say what he would argue, but that no matter what somebody says, that both are happening usually in some way. That it's hard to photograph that angel and just photograph what the angel's feeling. The photographer's feelings come through as well, and vice versa. So I think that's how he saw, and I think that's where he saw the energy of most art. Back to your point that you all did have your.
One more
Oh,
question.
yeah. Well, there were.
Oh, I wanted to know about any crossover between William Christenberry's work
Okay, so
and the correspondence.
there were. I don't think there was much correspondence. They were in some shows together, I know. Some of these, that's how I first met Paul, in a show with Christenberry as well, over, you know, sort of looks at the South kind of shows. Bill Christenberry has a copy of this book and saw an early mock-up of it. And there's no question that even though Alan Gevinson's question about color, Christenberry's a color photographer, Paul Kwilecki had great admiration for Christenberry's sense of time in his photographs, and that whole way in which he's interested in you know, the arc of time and how photography responds and communicates time.
You see that with the angel.
Yeah, you see that with the angel. And for those of you, William Christenberry returns to a lot of the same places in Hale County, Alabama, year after year after year, much more systematically, I would say, than Kwilecki, who was not a system guy at all. Was there any? All right. Thank you all very much. Oh, Alan, I'm sorry.
Well, I'm sort of thinking about his sort of gradually coming on the idea of documentary, but he was corresponding with people pretty early who talked about that. So I get the feeling from you, at least, that at least initially he didn't, you know, fall into that.
Well, he saw it in a pretty narrow definition. He saw documentary at that point as more FSA and connected to more propaganda, probably more sort of message. But also, I think that he's writing to Vestal, and nobody's using the word. He actually the first thing he talks about in here is a book. The first documentary reference is a book that I had to go look at. I recently got a book called Face of an Island, the work of a documentary photographer in South Carolina at the turn of the century. He's teaching himself through books, so if he didn't have the book, he didn't really know what was going on, or if it wasn't in Photo Techniques, which is where Vestal had his column. He eventually makes a connection with Yvonne Streetman at University of Florida and some folks at Florida State that teach photography, but essentially he's mostly writing these guys saying, should I continue, which is a terrible question to ask somebody, you know. David Vestal, here are my prints. Do you see anything here? Should I continue? He asked him that. And then, you know, how do I get richer blacks, and how do I get a better sense of contrast? What do I do with this film? What do I do with that film? A lot of technical stuff. And putting all that in this blender of his mind and going back in the darkroom. Fascinating kind of. Okay, thank you all very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.